let's take a look through every single Space Marine unit and its power and points costs in current Warhammer 40k 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines, and now that we have all of the points costs for Warhammer 40k 10th edition out in the open, I thought it would be fun to take a look through all the Space Marine datasheets and see how they're stacking up against each other now we know how much they cost. This video is supposed to be a bit of a counterpart to the Space Marines overview video that I did on the channel last week, taking a look through all the Marine datasheets and how they interact with each other, particularly focusing on their unit special rules and any changes to the stat line since 9th. I'll link that down in the video description below if you'd like to check that out. For this video though, we're going to talk through the points of all of the generic Space Marine units. For this one I am going to stick to the generic datasheets that could be fielded by most chapters, just for the sake of keeping things a little bit more condensed. I'm not going to touch on the many Space Marine unique special characters now for things like Salamanders, Imperial Fists and Ultramarines. If I do get a chance I will cycle back to talk about them again on the channel, though I do have quite a lot of other videos to make with around about 20 index videos still waiting in the wings. Games Workshop really has subjected us to a bit of a deluge of Warhammer 40k rules recently. In any case though, for this one I thought we'd go through each individual points cost within the index, pair that with some of the major things that the unit can do in game, and talk about how they might be weighing up against each other. Starting out, let's talk infantry squads. We'll start with battle line units, then Phobos and infiltration type things, and then some of the main damage dealers. For battle line units and index Space Marines, we've got 4 different units. Intercessors are 95 or 190 points. They have the sticky objectives and the heavy assault bolt rifles. Seem like solid troops to have on the front line, plus really quite a lot of characters can join them, so they still might be very relevant and have objective control too as well. The sticky objectives rule does seem kind of handy. Every so often that will score you a few extra points due to failed battle shock or the unit getting killed or something. Assault intercessors seem to be a bit cheaper, 90 points or 180 for a squad of 10. These guys get to reroll wound rolls against enemies on objectives, and again they have the potential to be a unit of choice for really quite a lot of characters to lead them, as they can be joined by a lot of Primaris characters that can't join other squads. Seem decent enough at that cost for skirmishing with enemy infantry and bullying them off objectives. Then we've got heavy intercessors at basically an even lower points cost than they were before, kind of. 110 points or 220, so just 22 points per model for that toughness 6 gravis. Perhaps they're finally at the stage where they're starting to look good versus the regular intercessors now. They do miss out on fancy combat weapons in the unit though. Their special rule is getting a +1 save against damage 1. They really do the durability thing big. Finally, tactical marines are a little bit cheaper than assault intercessors at 175 points for 10, and you can only take 10. They have less threat at either range or melee, but they trade that out with the opportunity to take heavy weapons and special weapons and sergeant weapons within their unit, so quite nice to have a hidden las cannon and melter gun or something. And they also get to fall back and shoot and charge. I have a feeling that they're going to be in a bit of an awkward place though. You really have to commit to a whole ton of them, and in general for objective scoring units, typically smaller units often tend to be best, running around and holding a point without having to overcommit to it. I'd say from these points, all 3 flavours of intercessors look kind of interesting, perhaps particularly with characters. The graphics certainly bring some very decent raw stats, but might still just suffer from that same old rule of just slightly overcommitting to an objective, and perhaps putting more points on it than you really need. For an extra 15 points over regular ones though, they do look kind of fun. Next up, we've got the Phobos and Scout units. Infiltrators I think are looking really nice here, 90 points or 180, and they get the forward deploy, the screening deep strike out to 12 inches, and a 6+ feel no pain as well. I feel like as with late 9th edition, these guys will be played and really quite a lot. They get borders onto points earlier. The screening deep strike is really quite big in 10th edition, where reserves seem to be a bit more of a thing, and they're tougher than normal as well to boot. The Incursors I think are similarly looking very good, 90 points for a small unit of 5. They scout 6 inches now, so are a little bit less of a mid-board threat, but their big thing is marking one enemy target for destruction. Your entire army gets a +1 to hit against that target. That's absolutely massive in terms of a potential shooting buff and could help out half your gun line focus down a threat. And I do quite like their Haywire Mine as well. That's actually some fairly solid insurance against getting charged, which would mean that they take down a chunk of enemies with them. Reavers are 95 points or 190. They scout, have a -1 leadership, trigger some battle shock, and have precision melee at AP0. Overall though, despite all that, I think I'm still kind of underwhelmed by them. The AP0 melee I think still is what does for them, and even with their battle shock things they can't make enemy units reliably fail, they're just going to reduce them down to a slightly higher chance of that. Eliminators have gone up in points from previously, up to 95, either as snipers or anti-elites with those las fusils, The Instigator Bolt Carbine can allow them to move, shoot, move still, and they can have some devastating wounds if they do choose to stay static. They still look useful, I think, but they definitely look a lot less standout than they did previously back when they were 75. They're just quite a lot less disposable as a frontline unit, and that limits your options into actually using them for their sniper ability, I guess. For the scouts, the regular squad is 70 or 140. They've gained an extra wounds now, and now they're cheaper than the Phobos, set up in the midfield, and are at least somewhat durable. The regular ones have a return to reserve rule. The sniper ones are a tiny bit more expensive at 75 and get damage to snipers, infiltrate, and can't be shot at greater than 12 inches. And particularly the last rule could make them kind of interesting for camping down on a far-flung objective, or even one on your home field. Could be kind of nice on a high ruin as well, particularly for getting an extra bit of AP. They could ride around in a land speeder storm if desired. That's 70 points, and its main job is that it can wing around with a firing deck squad worth of units in that. Could be nice enough with those sniper rifles, or even just some shotguns or bolters. And it's got a similar sort of rule to the Land Raider, allowing you to charge outside of it. Could deliver very long charges for the scouts. I think out of the Phobos and scouts, the infiltrators and incursors are perhaps looking some of the most interesting. Screen the midboard and mark any targets for big guns. Scouts and Stormers still look like pretty excellent utility though, particularly as the regular ones could still take a Thunderhammer as well. Could be kind of intimidating to zoom those out to midfield objectives and have them fight over them. The Sniper Scouts do look like an irritating unit to have to deal with too. Ranged infantry squads next, and the new Inferno squads are 90 or 180 with their strength 5 flavors and battle shock. Hellblasters are 125 or 250. They're looking a lot more usable, I think, with 2 shots out to 24 inches now, and they also fire on death on a 3+, which is very cool. They seem nice paired with a lieutenant or something for some lethal hits to punch up against vehicles. Eradicators are 95 or 190, a big points drop from before, but they've lost their double shoots and they have lost range as well. They're still okay at taking down monsters and vehicles due to getting big rerolls to hit and wound against them, but they're far more niche and less good against other things. The Desolation Squad I think are looking like one of the standout units of the index, at least on initial takes. 120 points is pretty mad for their damage profile. Genuinely pretty great damage directly with their super crack missile launchers, and then of course they pair that with a whole bunch of ignores line of sight shooting as well, firing off a bunch of anti-infantry launchers with their Castellan launchers, and then basically really quite a serious artillery shot with the Vengor. At 120 points for the 5 of them, that is incredibly good. I feel like they're going to be one of the stronger units in the Space Marine Codex from this. The new Stern Guard veterans actually aren't really all that much more than intercessors. 105 points or 210 for 10. I'd be more tempted to take them with the bolt rifles than the combis for devastating wounds and AP 1 shots. Plus they've got a devastating wound heavy bolter, which is kind of cool as well. I feel like it's going to be the usual sort of trade-off with the troops type choices, either getting more objective control with intercessors, or having a bit more threat against general purpose targets with the devastating wounds, and they do have that rather fun rule to shoot again once per game if they wipe out a unit. Devastators are 120 points, or 200 if you take the full squad. It's kind of cool that the second half of the squad doesn't cost you too much more, as that half can't take the extra heavy weapons that they have. I feel like las cannon spam seems like perhaps the best use of that. Good to get some focused fire there. Devastator Centurions are either 205 or 410 points, a lot tougher than the Marines on foot at toughness 7. A lot of their weapons became twin-linked though, which I don't think is the best news for them, and their special rule is trying to clear enemies off objectives, re-rolling hits against units holding points. Inceptors 115 for 3 or 230 for 6. The plasma cost the same as the bolters now, and both became twin-linked assault pistols. Quite nice that they can't get locked up anymore that way. They have come down in cost quite significantly, but then so has their damage output. Broadly speaking, I think they're probably better utility than previously though. Not having their damage output locked up if they get charged is a really big deal, and they've also got a 3-inch deep strike if needed, so can come down right in the opponent's midst, which is really quite an annoying threat, and you could get some pretty awesome positioning with them. Suppressors are 95 points, 3 shots at strength 8, AP -1 and damage 2. They hand out a -1 to hit. I don't think the damage output is massively outstanding for the cost, they're kind of just okay I'd say. Probably the best reason to include them is the -1 to hit that they get. The damage output's alright, but if you can just ping that into the biggest scariest enemy unit each turn, then having them do less damage seems broadly good for the whole army. Finally, for ranged units, servitors can take some heavy weapons. They've got a surprising 2+ ballistic skill if they're static, and they could also hide in squads via an attached tech marine. Probably still not enormously exciting at 55 points, but you can have some surprisingly dangerous multi-melters out of them, which might not be the worst thing in the world. Kind of surprising just how much extra damage they could bring to say a tactical squad or something. Out of the ranged units, I feel like quite a lot of these have had some interesting improvements. Definitely the Desolation Squad seems very scary. Devastators with las cannons seem kind of usable. I quite like the Inceptors with their dropping shenanigans with plasma. And Hellblasters as well seem a lot better now they're just 25 points per model, and their 3 weapons have been consolidated to be a bit more of a general purpose mid-range threat. For more melee infantry damage dealers, the Blade Guard veterans are either 100 or 200, 3 or 6, a little bit toned down though a broadly similar general purpose stat line. They lost their 2+ save but have gained some reroll ones either to hit or for their saving throws depending on whether damage or defense is important. For units that can lead them as well, they seem like an interesting squad for characters to attach to. They're perhaps the biggest and scariest foot-based infantry squad now that's neither Gravis nor Terminator. The aggressors are a bit more than the Blade Guard now, 110 points or 220 for 6. I guess you could have either classified them as range or melee, they do both fairly evenly. Their damage output has definitely gone down a bit, swapping double shots for twin-linked weapons now. Broadly speaking, I'd say that the unit's a lot more melee focused than it was in 9th edition, though still can hand out a bucket of AP-1 hits to infantry at close range. They seem like quite a decent squad, not too bad for characters to attach to maybe, things like that Gravis Apothecary for lethal hits. The command squad is 165 points and folded in the various specialists, the apothecaries and banners and things. They can revive units, have a banner for extra objective control, and the champions +1s to advance and charge and melee things. For firstborn characters that can't lead Blade Guard, they perhaps seem a fairly interesting unit for a combat firstborn character. They are definitely on the pricey side though, and pay for all those advantages. The Assault Centurions are 175 points or 350 for 6. They perhaps feel kind of equivalent to aggressors in their own way, close range anti-infantry, and some very serious anti-tank melee. They also get sustained hits too against vehicles and monsters, so are extra good at downing heavy stuff. Otherwise, the various Terminator units are at around about 200 points each, the standard Terminator squad a little bit more than the other two flavours, 200 points for 5, or a big 400 or 410 for 10 of them. The standard ones and the relics seem at least somewhat balanced to me, a similar sort of profile with some generalist power fists, and they also get that Fury of the First rule, allowing them to ignore modifiers and get a bit of a damage buff against the Oath of Moment targets. The Assault Squad is the same points cost and either has Storm Shields and Thunder Hammers or dual Lightning Claws. Probably the Storm Shields and Thunder Hammers are the more interesting and have the chance for some devastating wounds. They in particular seem quite nice with Oath of Moment with the full rerolls. At first glance, the regular Terminators and the Assault Squad seem at least kind of balanced to me. I feel like you could probably go big on either of them and support them with characters and stratagems. For the Assault Squads, the foot version is 95 and the jump pack is 115, double that for 10 models. I feel like the jump pack Assault Squad is still going to be worth the upgrade. All that fast movement is rather nice, plus I really like their mortal wound impact hits that they have, which is actually seriously quite savage. Average somewhere around 2 or 3 for even a 5-man squad charging, plus they should have a couple of damage 2 weapons with power fists and eviscerators. Seems pretty handy for 115 points. Vanguard veterans, on the other hand, I feel like just lose out kinda big versus the Assault Squad now. I guess their main advantage is taking Storm Shields for a 4+ invulnerable save, and they do get slightly better strength on their melee weapons as well with strength 5. Overall though, I feel like the cut in damage output probably isn't worth that. I feel like the Assault Squad seems just a bit better than them, jumping around the board with the damage 2 weapons and the mortal wounds. Overall, out of these guys, I feel like Blade Guards seem okay for character escorts. Aggressors and Assault Centurions both seem alright, though lack of invul saves will probably hurt them a bit. The Terminators seem okay at that points cost. They're definitely very durable, but might just be a little bit more lackluster on the damage output now the power fists are a lot more mid-strength. And otherwise, out of the jump pack guys, I do quite like the standard Assault Squad. They seem like solid skirmishers. For biker units, the Primaris Outriders can finally be taken in 3 or 6 squads. They're 115 points or 230, and an ATV that's attached is an extra 80. I must admit I'm not particularly enthused about them. They've got okay defense but kind of awful damage. I feel like maybe one of the best arguments for them is to escort one of those biker chaplains who does give them some decent enough buffs, but that might just be throwing good points after bad. The Invader ATB is 80 points, maybe not enormously changed here. His main thing is being able to return fire if enemies shoot mounted units near him. That is handy enough. Might have a little bit less choice though now that multi-melters went down to 18 inches. Out of the bike squads, I feel like the standard bike squad is massively better than the Outriders right now. 80 points for 3 of them or 160 for 6. They're not massively less durable than the Outriders, plus they get a whole swath of special weapons and sergeant melee gear. Just seem like they massively outcompete the Outriders point for point right now. Attack bikes are 55 points, and they gained a wound, which is quite nice against damage 2 weapons. They've got a similar sort of fire support rule like the ATV, and can still be taken in squads if you want to. Again, maybe seem okay for melter delivery, but they're not going to get buffs quite as easily now, and the multi-melters going shorter range still does hurt them. Finally, the scout bikers are 75 points or 150 for 6. Their defense has been improved a little bit as they've gained a wound up to 3. They've got better grenade launchers, scout 9 inches, and they've got a weird strategic reserve rule which kind of conflicts with them scouting. I'd probably just start them on the board, to be honest. I think they could be kind of fun for a disruptive first turn charge, or maybe just screening or move blocking the enemy. Could be annoying to keep a vehicle army in its own deployment zone. I probably wouldn't go too heavy on them. Out of these units though, I feel like probably the standard bike squad is the most interesting there. 80 points for some fast moving bikes with special weapons seems okay, and they're not too bad on the durability front. Land speeders and storm speeders next. Games Workshop really has helped out the storm speeders with a big toughness boost. Going up to toughness 9 means they're a lot more on par with battle tanks like rhinos in terms of durability. You'll actually need dedicated anti-armor to take them down. Not too bad when they're also very fast, but the main selling point I think is their special rules. I feel that the Hail Strike is still kind of underwhelming anti-infantry, but it's just got a bit of a god tier buff going on. Nominates one enemy target in range, and your entire rest of your army shooting gets an extra pip of AP against it. Seems absolutely amazing for the Oath of Moment target. You're going to be stacking a whole bunch of hits and wounds, so extra AP on all of those will just convert all that damage so much better. And seems kind of nice for artillery as well. Could be very nice for things like whirlwinds. Otherwise, both the Thunderstrike and the Hammerstrike are pricier, up to 160. Their guns get a whole load more work done, with a bunch of anti-tank between the two of them. Their buffs I both think are interesting, but maybe a tiny bit more niche. The Thunderstrike gives you a +1 to wound debuff against monsters and vehicles, very nice for focusing down a big heavy targets, but is sort of reliant on your opponent having one. And the Hammerstrike removes the benefit of cover, not too bad as it is going to be fairly easy to get in 10th edition, but maybe just a bit inferior to the extra AP, which does that and also helps against things that don't have cover. Otherwise, the standard land speeder seems pretty excellent for spotting for whirlwinds, as it helps blast weapons get +1 to hit and ignore cover, basically cancel the barrage penalties. Definitely too pricey to be a damage dealer in its own right, you will be buying it in for this special rule now. The Tornado's 95 points and brings a bit more threat, plus a fun strafing run for moving across enemy units. An average of 3 mortal wounds is quite nice there. Realistically, I still think that that's probably a bit pricey for it at 95 though. And finally, the land speeder Typhoon I think is interesting. It gets 2 shots with the Typhoon missile launchers, plus maybe a heavy bolter at long range, and then it's got a move shoot move rule, so you could potentially pop out, fire off your big guns, and then remain completely safe. I'd say its damage output is okay, but not super duper standout. But certainly seems annoying to have maybe 1 or 2 of these hovering around in the backfield, just plinking shots at the enemy army that they can't do much about unless they move fast or have ignores line of sight. Overall, I feel like the land speeders and storm speeders got very interesting indeed. Maybe the Hail Strike is my single favourite, even if its damage output isn't the best. I feel like most of them have their uses though. The Thunderstrike's amazing against vehicles, the regular land speeder is great if you're going heavy on artillery type things, and the Typhoon seems very usable in the backfield, but probably isn't going to carry the bulk of your damage output. For Walkers and Dreadnoughts, we've got some Firstborn ones and Primaris ones. The regular Dreadnought's 160 points, and I think that's kind of underwhelming for his stats. He has got a bit tougher though, and the main thing that he brings is an aura of reroll hit rolls of 1. I think that last bit with his Wisdom of the Ancients is really quite a good thing. Basically an old captain style aura, and it can apply to anything in your army, including really big scary tanks as well. Seems kind of solid to have a missile launcher and another big gun, and have him somewhere in the middle of your army taking pot shots and helping out all the other units while he does. The Ironclad Dreadnought does have some pretty serious damage output against monsters and vehicles. It's +1 to hit and wound both of those, but it's very hampered by a 6-inch move still. Even with the huge damage, I can't see him being enormously popular. The Contemptor Dreadnought, with the Assault Cannon and Multi-Melter, that one's 170. Again, kind of a weird unit in that its damage and defense is kind of rubbish for that points cost, but I guess you'd be buying it in for one rather cool special rule, where the first time it dies it gets to resurrect on a 2+ with d6 wounds remaining at the end of the phase. Pretty much guarantees it gets another serious turn worth of fighting done, unless your opponent can either shoot it and then charge it to finish it off in 1 turn. Realistically, probably a little bit pricey. I can't see too many people being tempted by that, though if you can bear with the lower damage profile, I feel like it could genuinely cause some opponents problems. Then the Primaris Dreadnoughts cost significantly more. The Redemptor's 225 and is a very solid generalist, toughness 10, a 2+ save, 12 wounds, and it gets -1 damage built in. A very tanky profile there, particularly with the 2+ armor and the toughness 10. This guy's going to be harder to take down than the vast majority of the tanks out there, and he still comes with a very generalist shooting profile with that macro plasma and a big fist in combat. I'd say it probably outweighs the Brutalis on 220. He brings big combat, but his multi-melters have got reduced in range a bit. I feel like without the -1 damage, the Redemptor pulls a bit ahead. The Ballistus Dreadnought is a much more of a ranged beast. 4 big anti-tank shots with d6 or d6+1 damage. He gets to reroll hit rolls against anything that's above half wounds, so he should get them at least most of the time. I can see why he's a fair bit cheaper than the others though. I feel like the Redemptor Dreadnought isn't far off his damage output just with its big macro plasma, and of course this thing doesn't have -1 damage or fights in melee. I'd guess it's probably not going to do quite enough to be the standout anti-tank choice in Codex Space Marines. It will be competing against really quite a lot of dedicated gunline units. Finally, for the Walkers, the Invictus Tactical Warsuit can scout 8 inches. It's got toughness 8 and a 3+ save, so it's still kind of vulnerable to things like plasma. It fires out really quite a hail of shots and is okay in combat, and its trick is to return fire against Phobos that are shot nearby it. I think I quite like the feel of it. Could be kind of fun if you've got a few Phobos units scattered around. Whenever that shooting rule does come off, it'll be quite a big deal. And I guess having at least some Walker threat in the midfield is kind of interesting, even if it's not quite as hard to kill as at least some of these. Overall, out of the Dreadnoughts and Walkers, I feel like actually just the standard Dreadnought with the Captain style rerolls doesn't seem too bad. A bit of damage output loss, but quite a handy buff that could affect a whole ton of units. And otherwise, out of the Primaris ones, I feel like the most expensive one, the Redemptor, probably wins out. -1 damage and decent enough shooting and melee seems like it's pretty well worth it. Next, we've got artillery and indirect fire units. First up, we've got the direct fire strike servo turret. 80 points for 1 or 160 per 2, and out of the 2 guns I think I prefer the twin las talon there. If they're the same cost, then now it's 36 inches, I think it beats out the autocannon. 2 decent anti-tank shots for 80 points seems kind of nice, even if it does have mobility issues. They do get a 4+ overwatch as well, which could certainly catch people by surprise. If your opponent moves a damaged vehicle in front of it, then that's actually a genuinely decent chance of bringing it down. 4 shots with a unit of 2, rerolling the wound roll. You've got a good chance of getting a d6+1 damage shot through, and that could be massive. Otherwise, the Thunderfire cannon's kind of rubbish in terms of damage output, some pretty mediocre anti-infantry fire, unless you give it some big buffs with things like the land speeders. Its main trick, though, is the Tremor Shell stratagem, which it basically gets just built into it every single turn. This one removes 2 inches from enemy move, advance, and charges, so it would significantly slow down an enemy Death Star. Would be incredibly annoying to ping that into a big enemy Terminator block and give them a good chance of being out the game for a bit. Definitely solid enough utility. Occasionally the indirect fire might actually be the difference between killing some enemies off an objective. Definitely feels like a utility piece though that you might not want more than one of. The Whirlwind though looks like the choice if you actually want to deal some genuine direct damage to the opponent. d6+3 shots at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2 is solidly general purpose. That's still going to be pretty scary, even if it's taking the -1 to hit and the cover debuff. A good chance of killing a Space Marine or 2, and I feel like you absolutely could run this in multiples if you wanted to. If you could bear to sacrifice Oath of Moment with them, then you've got some pretty scary looking artillery. Could pair incredibly well with a land speeder or 2 to mark the targets and make the blast weapons ignore cover and extra to hit. Ignores line of sight firepower that the opponent can't hide from is pretty brutal, and these ones come with some handy battle shock tests thrown in. Could be useful if you want to prevent a combat interrupt or something. Realistically though, they might be competing against the fairly scary looking Desolation squads. The Vengor launches on their own are quite nasty, plus the Castellans and the Super Cracks, but I still think that the Whirlwind's looking very solid just on its own right. Getting into tanks and vehicles proper now, and really quite a lot of these have picked up a few peripheral upgrades. Things like Storm Bolters, Stubbers and Hunter Killer missiles are all being bolted on for free now. Definitely helps out some tanks like the Gladiators and just about any of the firstborn vehicles with extra stuff on the top. The Gladiator tanks have all come out of this decently cheap, 145 for the Lancer and 155 for the other 2. I feel like all of them look usable at that kind of profile, particularly with core buffs basically no longer being a thing, and having access to really quite a lot of those focal buffs from the other units that we've talked about. I feel like actually the cheaper Lancer might be genuinely quite interesting now. 2 shots hitting on a 2+ with a massive d6+3 damage and a huge strength, plus a quill on optics to allow you to reroll hit rolls and wound rolls. It just seems ridiculously reliable at converting those enormous hits into damage. The Valiant and the Reaper both seem decent enough as either tanks or infantry though, and I guess are a bit more general purpose considering the Lancer only has the 2 really big shots and a few peripheral things. The Predator Destructor's 135 points. That one's now got the rapid fire 6 and 4 autocannon on the top. It gets AP -1 better against infantry, and you may as well pick up heavy bolters or las cannons on the sponsons. Seems kind of fine, but probably not massively stand out there. I guess it does get a free hunter killer missile and pintle bolter as well. The Annihilator's a little bit cheaper than the Destructor. I can probably see why, given that the top las cannon unfortunately got the twin links rule rather than 2 shots. Kind of sad to have this thing not having the 2 shots anymore. It gets to reroll damage results of 1, which might help you out a bit and save you some CP rerolls. The Vindicator has a very scary stat line with D6 plus 3 shots, strength 14, AP 3 and damage D6, genuinely dangerous to just about everything, but also seems like it's been dealt a pretty nasty blow with the costing. 205 points for one of these. Even with those kind of stats, I feel like that's probably just puts it out of contention for the most part. I feel like it's going to lose out to the other tanks with that kind of points cost. The Stalker gets the really big single shot that's particularly great against fly, 100 points for that. Still definitely one of the vehicles that's a lot more tough than it is dangerous. And the Stalker's 140 points, really quite significantly more now, but it does kick out really quite a hail of autocannon fire. 12 shots at strength 7, AP -1 and damage 2 should be pretty efficient against medium infantry, but most so against fly type units as it gets the anti-fly 2+ keyword, so it means that even against flying vehicles and things, even things like Necron monoliths, you'd be wounding on a 2+ and definitely stacking a whole bunch of saves. It does have some fun overwatch as well, potentially splitting fire 4 different ways, even if it will be a bit inaccurate that way. For the Land Raiders, with their rather cool assault ramps delivering units around 20 inches away, the standard Land Raider with the big las cannons is 275, the Crusader's 255, and the Redeemer is 295, paying a bit of a premium for those very scary D6 plus 3 flamers with damage 2. Definitely does seem to be one way that you can basically get a melee unit into combat a very, very long way away, and they are solidly tough. I feel like they have gone from being a very underwhelming unit in 9th edition to a very usable one, particularly as they can transport a whole host of stuff. I feel like aggressors might actually be a pretty reasonable choice to put in these things now. The Repulsor I think is actually looking really quite good at 195 points, sub 200 points now, and it gets really quite a lot of different attacks, a few big guns and then backed up by the Repulsor defensive array, 18 shots at strength 4, so well capable of clearing out some hordes. This thing does look like a really interesting transport for delivering shooting units in particular. Move the transport, get your shooting unit out, shoot down the enemy, and if they try to threaten them with a charge, then they can jump back in the repulsor, escaping to hopeful safety. For 195 points for a bit of a combined proposition like that seems quite good. I feel like it's looking a lot better on a durability front at that kind of cost compared with previously maybe. It does have a big toughness 12. The Repulsor Executioner is an extra 35 points above that at 230. This one trades out transport shenanigans for just a really, really big gun. At first take I'd say it's probably not standout at 230 points, though definitely isn't bad. My first guess would be that it's probably a bit outcompeted by the Gladiators, though I feel like again with the big toughness 12 it's going to be a bit better off than it was in 9th. Overall I feel like a fair few of these seem very usable but maybe not massively enormously stand out. Probably the ones that I'd be most interested in would be the Gladiator. I do quite like the Lancer with that profile, though I feel like the standard Repulsor and even the Land Raider could be sort of interesting as some very premier transport options. Talking of transports, we've got the dedicated transports. Rhinos are kind of similar at 85. They have gained some buffs though with a transport capacity of 12, improved toughness, the new transport rules to get out after they've moved, self-repair and a firing deck of 2, generally a bit improved all the way around there. And they even have a bit less chance of killing models when they get out of them, with Space Marines having 2 wounds. Overall they do look very solid. Probably the biggest issue with them is their choice of transport occupants, maybe reasonable enough for delivering things like Devastators perhaps. Getting the multi-melters within 18-inch range or within 9-inch range does seem like something that they could handle. The Razorback's 100 points. This one buffs squads with reroll wound rolls if you focus fire with both the Razorback and them. Again, that could be kind of fun for delivering Devastators maybe. Seems like the best combined option, particularly with multi-melters being kind of mid-strength. 4 rerolls to wound with them would be seriously nice, particularly against hard targets they're wounding on 5s. The Repulsor I think is going to be a lot more playable at 95 points. That one's been suffering from just being a bit overcosted for a while, to the extent where you never really want to run multiple squads in it. I think at 95 points it's looking massively better, even if the other transports in the game have stolen its special trick. It's got a number of decent top options. You could give it a 5+ invulnerable save, or a big missile launcher, which looks like one of the more interesting ones now they're the same points, and it has picked up the Firing Deck 6 special rule as well, which means that it could be a bit of a battle bus for a bunch of Hellblasters firing shots out of the back of it. That seems kind of fun, at least on paper. Otherwise, the drop pod's still 70 points, a bit of a luxury option to get deep strike early on. You can put Primaris in it now, so things like Hellblasters, Stern Guard, or maybe even Infernus Marines could be kind of interesting. Unleash a bunch of firepower before your opponent can react. Finally, we did mention the Landspeeder Storm earlier. This one can give some advance and charge to scouts, or just wing round the board with a whole bunch of them firing off sniper shots or missile launches out the back of it. I feel like, as before, it's quite a nice, fast and cheap little disruptive unit. Might be handy enough for jumping around scoring those tactical objectives. For the Space Marine Flyers, I don't feel like these guys are particularly standout. The new flyer rules I don't think were enormously kind to them. They lost the -1 to hit, and they either have to stay on the board and just move 20 inches each turn, or start off the board, arrive turn 2, and then have their movement locked into one straight path each turn. I guess they did get some boosted toughness values to go with that at least. I suppose that doesn't really hurt too much. I would say though that for the Stormhawk and the Storm Talon, the damage output doesn't seem to be enormously exciting. They've gained twin linked on a bunch of their weapons rather than double shots, which is generally a downgrade. They do have their special rule for being better either against fly units or against ground units, depending on the plane though. Probably out of the three of them, the one I find the most interesting might be the Storm Raven, though even then it might be a bit of a pricey sell. 265 points for a great big mini Thunderhawk. I think that this one works well with the new transport rules. Move a squad 20 inches, get out, and fire into the opponent's face. The Storm Raven backs it up with some fairly serious guns as well that you can equip your favourite ones for free. The Hurricane Bolters in particular look fairly dangerous with re-rolling wound rolls. It's just a tiny bit tougher than the other two with -1 damage, which I think will help justify its higher price tag. For fortifications, we've just got the Hammerfall bunker, which is going to be a very interesting one. It has gone right back up to 210 points, but now it actually lays down quite a serious amount of fire in the opponent's own turn. It's pretty tough with toughness 12, 14 wounds and a 2+ save. It fires off some heavy bolters in your own turn, plus the great big missile launcher on the top, though the main threat that it has is basically firing shots in the opponent's turn as well. It's got 6 shots, twin-linked heavy bolters that hit on a 4+. It gets to fire those at the end of each opponent's move, and gets to fire them up to 4 times each turn. If the opponent actually has some units that care about being hit by heavy bolters and they can't hide them, then that's going to be really quite a big deal. I feel like on more dense boards, when there's a whole load of terrain, it's still not going to be all that impressive. Your opponent might just be able to hide easily enough. Maybe in a more casual setting, when terrain might not be always quite as thick as it might ideally be, I feel like it could be a lot more powerful. Maybe even kind of oppressive against some light infantry armies that don't have enough terrain to hide in. Despite a potentially powerful rule though, probably not super competitive at 210 points I suspect. Finally, we've got the generic Space Marine characters. I'm sure much to the irritation of Xenos and Chaos players, Space Marines most certainly have a million different variants of the same HQ choices, and particularly the captains and lieutenants. The captains bring you 0 command point stratagems for your unit, and out of the HQ buffs, I feel like that's one of the single best things that you can have. 1 free stratagem each battle round, and you can't stack it with multiple captains as well, so it generally means that you want 1 but not more. They're really quite cheap for that inclusion as well, 80 points on the cheapest ones, going up to 100 on the jump pack one, and they all have a minor secondary buff as well as just their raw stat lines. The regular captain in the Primaris one gets +3 attacks and devastating wounds for 1 phase, basically going into rage mode on your most important combats. The biker captain can make the bike weapons assault, the Gravis captain can halve damage on him, not much good for your squad, but allows him to be a bit tankier when they're dead I suppose. The Phobos captain allows some redeployment shenanigans, and unlike a few of the rules in 10th edition, it does happen after you've determined first turn, so that could be quite powerful to redeploy some Phobos. The jump pack captain gives you +1 strength on the charge, kind of relevant for the strength 4 or strength 5 jump pack Vanguard veterans or assault squads. And lastly, the Terminator captain allows you to re-roll charges. That works alright with deep strike I guess. In general, just accessing the stratagem seems pretty amazing. Means that you can just trigger, say, Armour of Contempt for -1 to enemy AP if you've got nothing better to do if the squad's attacked. And otherwise things like Overwatch might be staples, or maybe the Space Marine one where they get the lance attacks on the charge as well. That could be seriously quite intimidating. I think you're definitely going to want a captain, it's just more of a question of where. Otherwise the lieutenants are kind of cheap, anywhere between 60 for the Phobos one and 80 for the standard one or the combi weapon one. Basically most of these give you lethal hits on your units, so auto wounds on 6s to hit. That's quite a powerful buff on anything that you're wounding on 5s in particular. The Lieutenant and the Primaris one double down on that with fallback, shoot and charge. Really not too bad to have on most units, as a little bit of insurance against being locked up. The Phobos one allows their units to fire and then move again, which is quite big for repositioning. Could get you a bit more movement towards an objective or stay out of trouble. The Reaver one gives you a little bit of a bonus to the Terror aura of the Reavers, pushing that out to 9 inches. And the Combi Weapon one basically kind of works entirely differently from the new Leviathan box, kind of feeling like he's a bit more of a mini assassin type Space Marine lieutenant. Can't be shot at greater than 12 inches, reactive movement and a feel no pain to keep him safe. He designates one objective to give other Space Marines a reroll 1 to wound against when enemy units are nearby that one. I feel like he probably just doesn't really quite do enough for his points cost, to be honest, even if he is very fun and hard to catch up with. I feel like most of the rest of them are really quite justifiable though. Giving one to Hellblasters seems kind of nice. That could have let them punch up against tanks really quite well. Same for Blade Guard as well. They've got mid-strength but damage 2 attacks, so again, punching up will be kind of nice. They do chip in with their own combat profile as well, with some damage 2 melee if you equip them with a mastercrafted power sword. Overall, again, the lieutenants seem kind of cheap, definitely add a decent amount of value to their unit, I think. Otherwise, we've got the Librarians, again fairly cheap, 75 to 90. They basically all do smite for a little bit of anti-elite shooting. The standard ones give you a 4+ invulnerable save, which is very nice on a valuable unit. Stern Guard or Hellblasters or even Desolation Marines might like that. Could be quite nice even for just intercessors going towards objectives as well. The Phobos one gives you stealth and can't be shot at greater than 12 inches. That's really quite nice for the Phobos troops, and again would be very big for objectives there. Having a force weapon hidden in the unit doesn't seem the worst idea either. The Jump Pack one boosts AP, which is very relevant for both of the Space Marine Assault Squad type things. Not a bad way to make them a little bit more threatening. And the Terminator one is basically your option for a direct damage buff to a stacked up Terminator squad. 90 points for sustained hits. Seems pretty usable for the points, particularly for a 10-man squad, though I guess you'd be weighing that up against the Captain, who's going to be giving you free stratagems on that monstrosity of a unit. The Chaplain's main value is giving you +1 to wound in combat. That seems handy enough for basically any of the melee troops. I feel like perhaps particularly Blade Guard or Terminator squads might kinda like that. Again, solid punching up against tougher targets there. The regular one and the Primaris one are a bit cheaper. They've got a once per game cancel battle shock, which I think is actually quite nice insurance. The Bike Chaplain can give you devastating wounds on your bike bolter fire within 12 inches. I guess that could make the Outriders just a little bit more threatening. The Jump Pack one gives you the chance of some mortal wounds before fighting, which I suppose is handy enough, and the Terminator one gives you a 4+ feel no pain against mortal wounds as well. That's pretty handy on the defensive, seeing as mortal wounds are quite good at killing Terminators. For the Tech Marines, there's either 65 for the Primaris one or 70 for the regular one, I guess just because it gets more fancy guns and things. They both are basically helping out your vehicles, +1 to hit for a big scary one, repair them D3, they've both got a little bit of shooting, and then if a vehicle dies somewhere near your Tech Marine, it's kind of fun that he goes into rage mode. Really quite cool, as that sort of gives him something to do if his charge gets destroyed. I feel like they're probably not going to change the world for that kind of points cost. Maybe just a unit that seems reasonable enough if you've got a great big scary tank to buff though. Perhaps could be alright on something like a repulsor maybe. And certainly doesn't seem the worst to have in the middle of a Dreadnought battle line as well. Support the Dreadnought that needs it most at the time. Finally, for characters, we've got perhaps the more elite support style characters. The Primaris Apothecary is really quite cheap now at 55 points. He's just got the rule to heal one model in the command phase and doesn't grant a feel no pain or anything. I feel like to include him you basically have to gamble on your squad getting attacked but not wiped. Sometimes might happen but might not be always. I feel like he'd really quite like to run with Blade Guard, but he's not allowed to attach to them unfortunately. He does generate a command point if his bodyguard gets slain as well, so I suppose you get that as a consolation prize. The Apothecary Biologist is kind of more like a Gravis Lieutenant really. Lethal hits on 6s, and if the unit kills something in combat then he samples them for science, and he becomes very high objective control for the rest of the game. The lethal hits seem solid enough on things like Aggressors and Eradicators perhaps, though I will bear in mind that both of those can get rerolls to wounds, so it might just have a little bit less impact there. The Ancients are there to give you a little bit of extra objective control. They just give you +1 objective control to your unit. The Primaris one is 55 points, and at least he can chip in a little bit in close combat as he actually gets a reasonable melee weapon. The Blade Guard one is kind of rubbish on his combat stats, though he does have a single use of +1 attacks to his Blade Guard. He only gets to use that once per battle though. Seems usable enough, and I guess it is on a unit that you'd want to have more objective control that's likely to be fighting over the midfield. The Terminator one is probably the best, but also the most expensive. 90 points. Terminators with extra objective control seems very handy with their big tough profile, and he also gives them damage buffs for a damaged unit that's taking casualties. That does seem pretty handy, as they are a reasonable unit that might well get injured but not killed. He can have a solid enough combat weapon as well, which doesn't hurt either. Otherwise, we've got the Primaris Champion, 55 points, so nice and cheap. Again, he adds some melee threat, and is perhaps just a little bit better than a standard Blade Guard. He also gives you +1 to advance and charge though, a 0 CP heroic intervention, and precision melee. I feel like he could be a kind of interesting upgrade for say something like a 3-man Blade Guard veteran squad, maybe weighed up against taking the full 6-man squad. You could just put him in a bigger unit of course as well, that also works. Finally we've got the Judas here for 75 points. He gives his unit fights first, so basically some very nasty charge protection for them. Means that they'll be able to strike first before they get hit, and he also chips in with a bit of precision melee with devastating wounds for that great big execution blade. Kind of feels in a similar sort of place to where he is now. Very nice to have if you can get it, but at 75 points that is quite expensive for it. Again, Blade Guard probably seemed like the best place for him. Could be alright in Assault Intercessors I suppose. Overall really quite a wide choice of Space Marine characters there. Out of all of them I feel like the captains maybe offer some of the best value. Lieutenants are quite nice for certain damage buffs for the right unit. I quite like the 4+ invulnerable save librarians, they look like they add quite a lot. And otherwise I think you could make arguments for all sorts of units supporting something like Blade Guard, whether it's Chaplains, Primaris Champions or Judasirs. Kind of a shame that a lot of these can't run with Gravis or Terminators anymore. It does maybe just restrict them in terms of which units they can buff. Overall, interesting to see these Space Marine datasheets in a bit more context now. Obviously everything's just a little bit on the theoretical side at this side. The points have only just come out and people haven't had much time to practice or have a go with lists. Just in theory land, here are a few of the datasheets that I feel stand out a bit more to me than some of the others. The Desolation Squad certainly seems massively scary shooting. Gladiator Lancers seem pretty dedicated, good anti-tank with long range. Infiltrators still seem to be exactly what you want in the mid-board. Nice cheap units with deep strike exclusion and harder to kill than you'd expect. The Incursors and the Stormspeeder Hellstrike seem like perhaps the two best units for just putting down massive shooting fire from the rest of your army. Light up a unit with maybe a +1 to hit and an extra AP. Your Space Marines are going to have crazy damage against that, and then you can use Oath of Moment on something different. I quite like the Repulsor with its transport shenanigans and being a bit cheaper. Whirlwinds seem pretty powerful for a bit of ignores line of sight firepower. I feel like you could certainly build around them a bit, with multiple ones of them using Oath or the Incursor and Stormspeeder buffs. And out of the characters, maybe Captains and Librarians with the 4+ invulnerable save seem very nice, plus Lieutenants look like they're solid value adding to a bunch of units too. Let me know your thoughts though, which Space Marine units are looking more standout out of this index, and what sort of units are you looking forward to putting on the table in 10th edition. If you've enjoyed the video then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, then I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.